A strange sensation began to hum at the edge of his awareness. It wasn't a sound, more like a vibration running along an invisible wire connecting him to Zara. He didn't hear her thoughts, but he felt her intention. When she shifted her weight to the left, he knew to look right. When he sensed a stone was unstable, she was already moving past it. They crossed the rest of the river not as two separate beings, but as a single unit. Their movements synced without a word or signal. The pack leader continued to watch from the shore, its intelligence now seeming frustrated, even confused. This was not human behavior. This was something else. Something coordinated on a level it hadn't encountered. They reached the far bank, dripping and cold but unharmed. The Cathari did not follow. They lingered at the water's edge for a moment longer before melting back into the trees, their tactical advantage broken by a simple, unexpected refusal to play by their rules. Kevin stood breathing hard, the adrenaline slowly fading. He looked at Zara. She met his gaze, her expression calm, but her eyes held a new depth. That hum of connection was still there, faint but undeniable. It wasn't just trust between allies. It was the first true flicker of the life bond, a telepathic thread stitching their instincts together. It promised a partnership far stronger than any tactical agreement. It was the beginning of a shared mind. The wind picked up sharply, driving a cold rain that stung like needles against their skin. They had no choice but to seek shelter. The cave mouth was a dark slit in the rock face, half hidden by thick vines. Inside, the air was still and carried the damp, mineral smell of deep earth. The only light came from the storm flashing at the entrance, casting brief, jagged shadows that leaped and faded. Then Kevin saw the walls. They weren't smooth stone. They were covered in pictographs, carved and painted with pigments that still held faint color after who knew how many seasons. The images showed tall, slender figures with blue skin and large eyes alongside figures that were unmistakably human. They stood together, not fighting. They held tools, raised structures, pointed at stars. They were working side by side. His understanding of this world tilted. All colony records, all initial surveys marked this as an uncharted planet. No prior contact, no signs of intelligent life beyond the hostile Cathari. Yet here was proof, carved into the rock they were standing in, that humans had been here before. They had met Zara's people. They had built something together. Zara ran her fingertips over a carving of two figures clasping forearms. Her voice was quiet in the cavern, almost absorbed by the stone. "My people have met yours before." She didn't look at him, her attention fixed on the ancient story surrounding them. "Long ago, a ship like yours came from the sky. Some of your people stayed, learned our ways, shared theirs. Others left, followed different stars. This cave wasn't just a hiding place. It was a relic, a monument to a first contact that history had forgotten. The bond between him and Zara, that faint hum of connection that had begun at the river, grew stronger here. It felt less like a new thread and more like an old one, vibrating with a shared legacy he never knew existed. It wasn't just about the two of them anymore. It was about their species, a shared past that had been waiting underground for someone to find it. She turned finally, her eyes catching a flicker of lightning from outside. There is an old saying, a prophecy some call it. It whispers that when the shadow grows strong and the children of the sky are in peril, the first alliance will be remembered. The separated ones will find each other again. Her words hung in the air, simple and heavy. This wasn't a random encounter. Their meeting, the Cathari threat, this storm driving them to this specific cave, it felt less like chance and more like a pattern clicking into place after a long silence. The potential for their future wasn't something they had to invent from nothing. They were walking a path that had been laid down long before they were born. The choice to trust her, to explore this bond, was no longer just a tactical gamble or a personal risk. It was the reactivation of a forgotten agreement between species. It was coming home. The storm howled at the cave mouth, but inside the silence felt heavy and complete. It was the kind of quiet that let a man hear his own thoughts too clearly. Kevin stood before the ancient carvings, the proof of a shared past he never knew, and faced the deepest fear he carried. He could continue as he always had, a leader alone, a fortress of one making every hard call himself, carrying every ghost until the Cathari finally broke through or the generators died for good. It was a clean end, predictable, he knew how to be, alone. Or he could choose the thing that terrified him more than any, play connection. To open the gates he'd built around his grief and let someone else see the damage. to risk a wound that wouldn't bleed but would cut far deeper than any physical blow. It was the vulnerability that shook him. To bond was to surrender the one defense that had never failed him, his solitude. He thought of Sarah, not with the sharp guilt that usually came, the image of her in the medbay, the sounds of the ship tearing apart. This time he remembered her laughter in the mess hall, the way she'd roll her eyes at his overly detailed patrol schedules. He remembered the love, not just the loss. She hadn't fought for a future of slow, grim survival. She'd fought for life. His mind turned to the children in the colony's root cellar. Their faces were thin, their eyes too old for their age. Their future was a blank page, and his leadership was offering them only a story that ended in a slow fade to darkness. Zara's way, this bond, it was a wild card, a chance to write a different ending, not just for them, but for everyone. Zara stood nearby, not pushing, not pleading. Her presence was a calm, patient question in the dim light. She watched him, her blue skin almost shimmering in the dark, her expression unreadable yet utterly open. She had offered everything. Now she waited for his answer. His throat was dry. The words felt like gravel when they finally came out, rough and unused. "Will you bond with me?" It wasn't a grand speech. It was a simple, stark question that cost him more courage than charging a Cathari nest. Zara didn't smile. Her response was solemn, a ritualized pledge spoken in a voice that was soft but carried absolute certainty. "The bond is sought. The bond is accepted. From this breath we are one spirit and two bodies. Your grief is mine. Your hope is mine. Our fate is shared." She placed her hand over his heart. Her touch was cool, but a warmth spread from it through his chest. A sensation that was both terrifying and profoundly calming. A new awareness clicked into place in his mind. Not her thoughts, but her presence. A steady, quiet light in a corner of his consciousness that hadn't been there before. The isolation he had worn like armor was gone. In its place was a connection that felt ancient and right. This was no longer just a personal choice, a gamble for his own heart. It was a strategic turning point. The leader of humanity's last colony had just irrevocably tied his fate, and by extension the fate of his people, to an alien woman and her ancient ways. The story of this world had just divided into before and after. The harsh clang of the alarm bell cut through the morning quiet. It wasn't the usual alert for a perimeter breach. This was the colony-wide alarm, a sound reserved for immediate, overwhelming danger. Kevin was on his feet before the second ring, the cold remnants of yesterday's bond ritual still humming in his veins like a second heartbeat. He didn't need a report to know. The Cathari were here, and they weren't testing the fences this time. They hit the weak points with surgical precision, the eastern gate, where the solar relays were still patched with scrap metal, the medical tent isolated on the northern edge, the water purification substation. It was a coordinated assault designed to cause maximum chaos, to break the colony's spine in the first few minutes. Their timing felt perfect, almost cunning. As if they knew the leadership had just undergone a profound change, a moment of potential vulnerability. Kevin and Zara moved at the same instant, surging from the command tent, not as two separate beings but as a single entity pivoting toward the threat. There were no words, no discussion of strategy. The life bond between them was a live wire, a constant flow of intention and awareness. He felt her focus shift toward the eastern gate an instant before he saw the first Cathari scout scale the wall. She sensed his concern for the med tent and was already angling her movement to cover that approach. He anticipated her moves. As she flowed toward a group of attackers near the water station, he knew she would feint left. He provided covering fire to the right without a signal, cutting off their retreat. She covered his gaps. When a Cathari warrior lunged from a blind spot at his flank, a throwing knife from Zara's hand embedded itself in the creature's shoulder before Kevin's own instincts could fully register the threat. They fought not as a human and an Alari, but as a single weapon. Human aggression fused with Alari tactical wisdom. Kevin's direct, powerful strikes created openings that Zara's swift, precise attacks exploited. Her understanding of Cathari pack behavior allowed her to predict their movements, and Kevin's combat experience turned those predictions into devastating counters. They became a cascade of coordinated strikes, a dance of defense and retaliation that was beautiful and terrible to witness. They focused on the vulnerable. Instead of engaging the main force head-on, they moved to where the colonists were most exposed. They herded a group of children toward a reinforced storage bunker, Zara creating a distraction with a series of sharp whistles that confused the hunters while Kevin laid down suppressing fire. They fought not to kill every Cathari, but to protect every human. The bond allowed this. It let them manage the entire chaotic battlefield as a single problem, their two minds working in parallel. The tide of the fight began to turn. The Cathari, accustomed to exploiting fear and disorganization, found themselves facing an opponent that operated with a unified, unspoken purpose. Their numerical advantage meant little against a defense that anticipated every probe and countered every thrust. The pack leader, watching from a rise, let out a frustrated snarl. This was not the fractured, desperate resistance it had come to expect. This was something new. This was a wall that had learned to think. The telepathic connection had turned a battle for survival into a display of perfect synchrony, and for the first time, the hunters were the ones who seemed outmatched. The forest moved. It was the only way to describe it. The trees themselves seemed to shift, and from the shadows flowed figures of blue and gray, materializing with a silence that was more startling than any war cry. The Aleri were here. They moved into the fray not as a chaotic wave, but as a coordinated force, their movements precise and interlocking. Their counter-assault was a fearsome thing to behold. A beautiful and terrible dance of calculated violence that met the Cathari's brute force with seamless strategy. They weren't just allies showing up to lend a hand. They were co-leaders entering a fight they now shared. They didn't wait for orders from Kevin. They assessed the battlefield with a practiced eye and flowed into the gaps in the human defense, strengthening weak points and reinforcing faltering lines. A group of them created a shield wall near the medical tent, their interlocked formations allowing human marksmen to fire over their shoulders with clear shots. Another unit used strange weighted nets to trap and isolate Cathari hunters, making them easy targets. They fought with a unity that spoke of deep tradition and shared purpose. This willingness to fight and die alongside humans wasn't born from recent diplomacy. Their people carried a living memory of alliance, a history etched in caves and whispered in prophecies. They remembered a time when humans and Aleri stood together. Zara's bond with Kevin became the linchpin of this new coalition. It was the living proof that the old ways could be revived, that the separation could end. The Aleri warriors looked to them not as two separate leaders, but as a single command entity. Their bond a symbol of the unity they were all fighting for. In a brief lull near the smoldering eastern gate, the Aleri commander approached Kevin. Her face was streaked with ash. Her eyes held the same calm intensity as Zara's. She didn't offer a temporary truce or a simple military pact. She offered a formal bond of peoples. Human spirit paired with Aleri wisdom, she stated, her voice carrying the weight of her entire tribe. It was an offer to merge their futures completely. The immediate goal was clear. A combined operation to drive the Cathari from this region for good, to reclaim the territory for a new, shared colony. Kevin looked out at the mixed forces already working together. Humans passing water-skins to blue-skinned warriors. An Aleri medic showing a human soldier how to apply a poultice. The old isolation was gone, burned away in the fire of this shared defense. He accepted, but it was more than accepting an ally. He was accepting a role within their structure, a place of leadership that answered to both his people and hers. He was no longer just the commander of a human colony. He was a partner in a tribe's future. The emergence of the Aleri as full partners changed everything. The battle was no longer a desperate last stand. It became the first engagement of a broader coalition. The survivable future he had barely dared to hope for was now a tangible plan taking shape on the battlefield. They had the numbers now. They had the shared tactics. Most importantly, they had a united command, linked by a bond that promised no more fighting alone. The tide didn't just turn. It reversed completely, flowing back toward the hunters with a force they could not contain. Courage alone couldn't win this war. They needed a fortress. The Thornwall Canyons offered that, a tangle of narrow passes and steep rock walls that would force any attacker into predictable paths. The decision to abandon the original colony site wasn't made lightly. It meant leaving behind solar arrays they'd spent months building, the graves of their dead, the last tangible pieces of their crashed ship. It was a retreat but not a surrender. It was a strategic withdrawal to ground they could actually hold. Evacuating everyone required a trust that hadn't existed weeks before. Humans had to put their lives in the hands of blue-skinned guides who led them through hidden trails and underground streams. Parents handed their children over to Alari scouts who promised safe passage through caves the Cathari didn't know about. The journey was tense, conducted in near silence, every ear straining for the sound of pursuit that never came. The Alari knew this land in a way that was more than just map knowledge. They understood its rhythm, its secrets, its hidden veins. Kevin and Zara orchestrated the fusion of two fighting styles into a single defensive plan. They stood on a high ledge overlooking the main pass, the wind whipping at their clothes. Below, mixed units of humans and Alari trained under the watchful eyes of Ilari commanders. The strategy leveraged their unique strengths. Human aggression, that raw, direct force born of desperation, would hold the choke points. They would be the anvil, solid and unyielding in the narrowest parts of the canyon. The Alari would be the hammer. Their strategic wisdom maximized every inch of defensible ground. They positioned archers on impossibly high ledges, set subtle rockfall traps on approach paths, and created overlapping fields of fire that would punish any advance. They didn't just see a rock wall. They saw a series of interconnected defensive layers. It was a complete rethinking of combat, moving from simple defense to active control of the battlefield. The life bond between Kevin and Zara became the nervous system of this new organism. Its telepathic threads allowed for instant, instinctual teamwork, not just between them, but it began to resonate through the entire command structure. A human squad leader would feel a sudden urge to shift position seconds before an Alari spotter on a cliff above spotted movement. A whispered command from Zara would be understood and acted upon by human troops without a word being spoken over the comms. It was coordination on a level that no traditional army could ever achieve. This was more than a military defense. It was a civilizational project. As they fortified the canyons, they weren't just building barricades. They were laying the foundation for a new kind of settlement. Human engineers worked with Alari stone shapers, combining Earth-derived metallurgy with alien understanding of local materials. They rerouted a freshwater spring to create a secure water source, designed ventilation for the deep caves, and began planning terraced gardens on south-facing slopes. The goal shifted from mere survival to building a home. They called it the First Alliance, a conscious effort to combine human engineering with Alari wisdom. It was a promise written in stone and action. Every constructed wall, every shared meal, every coordinated drill reinforced it. The Thornwall Canyons were no longer just a natural fortress. They were the birthplace of a new multi-species civilization. A strategic stronghold forged from mutual respect and a shared will to build a future together, turning a desperate retreat into the first step toward a lasting victory. The air in the grove felt different. It was still, heavy, and carried the scent of wet stone and old leaves. Standing stones rose from the moss like broken teeth, forming a rough circle around a pool of water so still it looked like a sheet of dark glass. This place held a deep power, an energy that hummed against the skin. This was the heart of the old world, a nexus where the past felt closer than the present. A figure waited for them by the water. It looked neither human nor Alari, its form seeming to shift slightly in the dim light, made of shadow and memory more than flesh. This was the Guardian, a being as old as the stones themselves. It did not speak with a mouth, but its words formed directly in their minds, carrying the weight of centuries. It spoke of a pact from a time before time, an agreement that predated all the modern rivalries and wars that had fractured the galaxy. Humans and Alari did not just share a potential future. They carried a shared legacy, the First Alliance. Their species had met long ago, had built together, had trusted one another. This grove was a monument to that forgotten unity. The Guardian's silent words painted a picture of a golden age of cooperation, a time when the choice to work together had pushed both peoples to heights neither could have reached alone. Then the Guardian gestured toward the dark pool. The still surface shimmered and changed. Visions bloomed in the water, not as blurry possibilities, but as sharp, vivid scenes of what could be. They saw joint settlements on a dozen different worlds, structures that blended human angular design with Alari organic flow. They saw ships crewed by both species moving through the stars, not as conquerors but as explorers. They saw a cooperative expansion, a future where fear was replaced by shared curiosity and ambition. It was a future built not on one species dominating another, but on the combined strength of both. But the vision shifted. The Guardian's presence grew urgent, and the warning it issued was a cold wave that washed over them. The Cathari mass for a final assault. The images in the pool showed countless Cathari warriors moving through the forests, their numbers greater than any scouting report had suggested. They were gathering for one overwhelming push, a storm meant to wipe the fledgling alliance from the planet forever. The Guardian explained their fear. The Cathari were not just attacking a colony. They were trying to crush the reawakening of these old powers. They feared the life bond, the unity it represented, the ancient magic it was built upon. To them, the bond was a threat to their entire way of existence, which was built on division and domination. They would throw everything they had at the Thornwall Canyons to ensure that the First Alliance would die a second time, permanently. The revelation settled over Kevin and Zara. The life bond between them was not a new creation. It was the oldest magic, the original choice their species had made. It was the fundamental decision to fight united instead of perishing separately. Their personal connection was simply the reactivation of a circuit that had been broken for millennia. The power they felt wasn't theirs alone. It was the echo of that first ancient pact. The coming battle would not just decide the fate of a colony. It would be a verdict on that choice itself. Would they fight as one, or would they fall divided? The Guardian's message was clear. The power to decide had been placed back in their hands. The Guardian's gesture was not an ending. It was a beginning. From the shadows behind the standing stones, figures brought forth weapons. Not crude tools of survival, but artifacts of a forgotten age. Swords with blades that seemed to drink the light. Spears with hafts of dark, polished wood. Bows strung with something that hummed like a live wire. These were not mere metal and wood. They were concepts given form, hope made solid, unity given an edge. They had been forged in the deep places of the world, the Guardian explained without words, in fires that burned long before either of their peoples had touched this soil. Each piece hummed with a low potential energy, a promise waiting to be fulfilled. They felt alien and familiar all at once in their hands, the balance perfect, the weight distributed with an intelligence beyond simple smithing. Kevin and Zara took on the task of distribution. They moved through the ranks of their combined force, human and Alari, placing these ancient tools into willing hands. It was a quiet ceremony. There were no grand speeches. A teenager from the colony, his face still soft but his eyes hardened by loss, accepted a short sword. The blade felt light, yet he knew it could cut where their scavenged metal would only scratch. An Alari hunter, her blue fingers tracing the runes on a bow, nodded once. Her expression shifted from grim determination to something colder, sharper. Ready, the weapons did more than arm them. They felt like an extension of the life bond itself. The same hum that connected Kevin and Zara seemed to resonate in the polished metal and strung cable. A human soldier found his grip adjusting automatically, his stance shifting to a more efficient posture he'd never been taught. An Alari scout knocked an arrow and felt the aim steady itself, as if the bow knew where the target would be. It was a synergy of wielder and tool, a physical manifestation of the unity they were fighting for. The pervasive sense of waiting prophecy that had hung over the canyon for days finally shattered. It was replaced by a concrete, tangible readiness. The act of holding these weapons changed their posture, shoulders straightened, jaws set. Eyes that had been scanning the horizons for the next threat now looked with calculation, measuring distance and angle. The mood in the stronghold shifted perceptibly. The low murmur of anxious conversation faded, replaced by the soft, purposeful sounds of final preparations. Blades being honed, leather straps tightened. Last-minute tactics whispered. The colony was no longer just surviving, hunkered down and hoping to outlast the storm. It was preparing to win, to meet the coming onslaught not as prey, but as a united front armed with the legacy of its own past. The multi-species offensive, once a desperate concept sketched in the dirt, now had its tools. It had its teeth. This was the final piece. Against the Cathari's overwhelming numbers and crude, brutal weaponry, their scavenged gear and makeshift barricades would have meant a slow, inevitable defeat. These gifts from the First Alliance were their only real chance. They were the equalizer. They turned a likely massacre into a fight that could actually be won. The deep hum of the weapons was an answer to the coming silence of the Cathari advance. It was the sound of a future refusing to die. Kevin's plan was a layered trap built on three foundations: the terrain of the grove, the power of the ancient weapons, and the life bond flowing through his people. It turned their greatest weakness, being outnumbered, into a potential strength. The Cathari were masters of siege warfare, of applying relentless pressure until defenses cracked. They understood attrition. They did not understand a fight that refused to be fought on their terms. He fused human ingenuity with Alari teamwork, creating a strategy that was fluid and reactive. The life bond network was the key. It was no longer just a connection between him and Zara. It had spread, a subtle hum linking the minds of every human and Alari warrior who had accepted the ancient weapons. The entire defensive force began to feel like a single organism, an entity with hundreds of eyes and limbs but one shared consciousness. It was a telepathic army that could anticipate every enemy move not through guesswork, but through a shared, instantaneous awareness. This network allowed for a level of coordination the Cathari could not foresee. As the first Cathari scouts appeared at the mouth of the canyon, a small group of human and Alari volunteers detached from the main force. They didn't look like soldiers. They looked like desperate survivors making a break for it, scattering into the rocky hillsides. Their role was harassment and disorientation. They would hit the Cathari flanks with hit-and-run attacks, using slings and the occasional arrow from the new bows, then melt back into the terrain. They were the lure, the irritant. Their goal was simple: to make the Cathari commanders believe the alliance was breaking, that their forces were fragmenting in panic. They needed the enemy to commit, to send divisions scrambling into the uneven ground in pursuit of what they thought were easy targets, to divide the overwhelming mass of the siege force into smaller, manageable groups. Meanwhile, the main force remained hidden within the sacred grove itself, a coiled spring held taut. They waited in absolute silence among the standing stones, the ancient weapons cool in their hands. They were the anvil. They did not watch the skirmishes in the valley below with their eyes alone. They felt them. A volunteer would feel a surge of fear as a Cathari hunter closed in, and a nearby Alari archer, hidden on a ledge, would feel the precise direction of that fear and loose an arrow without needing to see the target. The harassing units drew the Cathari in, and the hidden force tracked their every movement through the shared nerve of the bond. The moment came when the Cathari command finally took the bait. A large portion of their force broke from the main body, surging into the side canyons after the fleeing volunteers. Their formations, once tight and imposing, now stretched and unraveled across the broken landscape. This was the signal. The moment of maximum vulnerability. The main force struck. They did not charge with a roar. They emerged from concealment with a terrible, silent purpose, flowing into the fragmented Cathari lines. The ambush was not a single event, but a wave of perfectly timed, localized attacks all happening at once. A Cathari warrior would turn to face a human with a humming sword, only to have an Alari knife find its back from an angle it never saw. Attackers found themselves surrounded by defenders who seemed to anticipate their every lunge and feint. The Cathari's siege, their patient mastery of attrition, unraveled in minutes under the weight of complete surprise and psychic unity. Their numbers meant nothing when they could not bring them to bear. Their coordination was shattered by an enemy that moved with a single unstoppable mind. The scent of crushed moss and spilled blood hung thick in the grove. The final clash had been a brutal, close-quarters storm of blades and alien shrieks, the sacred stones now scarred with plasma burns and dark stains. Stars were born in that fight. Warriors from both peoples performing acts of courage that would be sung about for generations. Stars were also extinguished. Names were added to the long list of losses. Victory was decisive. The Cathari broke, their siege shattered, their forces retreating into the deep forests. But the victory was not clean. It came soaked in grief. The life bond's grand promise was tested in that fire. Kevin felt the shock of each loss through the network. A sharp, shared pain that was both terrible and unifying. It wasn't just his own grief anymore. It was theirs. A young Alari scout he'd never spoken to fell, and the sudden void in the bond was a cold punch to his chest. A human engineer died holding a choke point, and Zara's breath caught as if the air had been stolen from her lungs. This deep connection meant mourning strangers as kin. It began to redefine everything. The old human dream of conquering the stars felt small and lonely compared to this. The galaxy could become something else. A place for cooperation, not just conquest. But that new order was impossibly fragile. The Great War was over, but the real work was just beginning. It required builders, not soldiers. The mood in the camp the next morning was a strange mix of relief and exhaustion, the high of survival already giving way to the dull ache of cleanup and burial. Kevin walked among them, his focus shifting. He wasn't just looking for security threats anymore. He was watching how human medics worked with Alari healers, how they sorted supplies together, how they built a single pyre for their dead. These small, quiet acts of building were the new front line. His leadership had to mature. The easy part was over. The hard part was diplomacy. He was no longer just a commander protecting his tribe. He was the first human ambassador, a steward for a delicate, unprecedented alliance. He had to navigate the vast differences between his individualistic people and the Alari's deep-seated need for consensus. He had to balance their needs, soothe their distrust, and make them see a shared future when their pasts were so separate. Every decision was a negotiation. Every policy required approval from two councils. He spent less time with a rifle and more time listening. He sat in long, quiet meetings with the Alari commanders, learning their ways, explaining human needs. He mediated disputes over resource allocation, over construction plans, over the very layout of their new blended settlement. It was tedious, grinding work. It lacked the clear adrenaline of a firefight. But it was the work that would determine if they lived or died in the long run. The shift in galactic power was real. The Cathari were gone. But the peace they had won would only last if they could build something worth protecting on its foundation. The war's end was not the conclusion. It was the confirmation of a choice, a lasting shift away from isolation and toward a stubborn, difficult, necessary cooperation. The battlefield was quiet. The real fight for their future had just begun in the meeting tents and half-built halls of their new home. Peace brought a new enemy, one that wore a human face and spoke with the voice of loss. The threat wasn't a Cathari blade in the dark. It was a cold resentment growing in the hearts of his own people. A faction of humans led by a grieving engineer who had lost his entire family in the crash began to murmur. Their leader, Roberts, had a face lined with sorrow and a heart hardened by it. He argued not for strength but for supremacy. He claimed human technology and knowledge made them the superior species. He wanted to sideline the Alari, to reduce them to second-class citizens in the very alliance they had bled to build. He saw their different ways not as strength but as weakness. The tension came to a head at a general assembly. Roberts and his followers had seized control of the colony's main power generator, a move that threatened everyone's survival. He stood before the mixed crowd, his words sharp and bitter. "We're the advanced species here," he declared, his voice tight with a grief that had curdled into arrogance. "We have the knowledge, the technology, the superior weapons. Why should we be equal partners with creatures who still fight with bone spears?" His argument was a simple, ugly one, might made right. Technological advantage meant inherent superiority. It was a philosophy that echoed the Cathari, not the founders of a new civilization. Kevin faced a stark moral crossroads. He could side with Roberts, appeasing a portion of his own kind to maintain a fragile peace built on injustice. Or he could defend the alliance, risking a human civil war that would destroy everything they had built. Justice and unity felt like opposing forces pulling him apart. He stood and appealed to their shared memory, to the credibility they had all earned through blood and sacrifice. He spoke of the medical tent the Alari had defended, the children they had saved, the knowledge of the land that had kept them all alive. He pointed out that human technology had failed them during the crash, while Alari wisdom had been their only refuge. Then Zara stepped forward. Her presence was calm, a stillness in the center of the brewing storm. She didn't raise her voice. Her words were quiet, clear, and they landed with the weight of absolute truth. She looked directly at Roberts. "You speak of superior technology as if it makes you superior people," she said, her tone even. "But technology without wisdom is just elaborate tools for destroying ourselves." She dismantled his argument not with anger, but with simple, observable fact. She reminded them all that their survival was a product of combined strength, not isolated superiority. Her final statement was not a plea, but a declaration of undeniable reality. True strength comes from lifting others up, not standing on their backs. She looked out at the assembly, human and Alari alike. "You want to know who will build the ships that carry us to the stars? We will. All of us together. Human knowledge and Alari wisdom working in harmony to create something neither could achieve alone. She stated that their futures were now inseparable. To break the bond was to choose death for everyone. The mood in the room shifted. The cold logic of supremacy melted under the warmth of her simple, powerful truth. People looked at each other, remembering the fights they had won side by side, the shared meals, the shared losses. The assembly was swayed. The unity they had fought for proved stronger than the fear and prejudice Roberts had tried to sow. Facing this unified front, his support evaporated. He backed down, his demands collapsing under their own hollow weight. The immediate crisis was over, but the lesson was seared into them all. The equality they had built was a fragile achievement. It was not a trophy won in battle to be placed on a shelf. It was a living thing that required constant vigilance, daily effort, and the courage to confront the shadows within their own hearts. It had nearly destroyed everything, and that knowledge would never leave them. 3 years after the final clash in the Grove, the first hybrid ship slid into the sky. Its engines made a sound that was new to the world, a deep thrum that was part human reactor and part Alari harmonic crystal. It moved with a grace that belonged to neither species alone. The vessel was a physical thing, made of metal and composite, but it was also a testament, a living proof that the First Alliance was more than a military pact. It was a functioning civilization that could build, not just defend. The challenge had shifted. Survivability was no longer the question. They had secured their foothold on this world. The new question was expansion. How did they turn this hard-won safety into a future that reached beyond a single canyon system? The answer was hanging in the air before them, its hull gleaming in the sun. This ship was that ambition given form. It had to carry their hope into the void and make it real. Its crew was a mix. A human pilot whose father had died in the crash now sat beside an Alari navigator who had lost her sister to a Cathari ambush. They wore uniforms that blended human functional cuts with Alari flowing lines. In the mess hall, they shared meals that were a fusion of earth starches and Xerion tubers. Their shared purpose was not just exploration. It was the act of becoming something new. Human and Alari identities began to soften at the edges, blending into a single, exploratory purpose that was greater than the sum of its parts. Kevin and Zara stood on the observation ridge, their hands clasped tightly together. They watched the ship grow smaller, a silver speck against the vast blue. The wind tugged at their clothes, but they didn't move. This was the moment they had fought for, bled for, built for. It was quiet. There was no cheering crowd, just the two of them and the hum of the ship fading into the upper atmosphere. Kevin's gaze remained fixed on the vanishing point. His voice was low, almost lost to the wind. Sarah would have loved to see this. He didn't speak of her often. The memory was still a quiet, permanent ache in his chest. But this felt different. It was not a loss to be mourned, but a presence to be acknowledged. Zara's fingers tightened around his. She didn't look at him, her eyes also on the ship. She is part of this too. Her words were simple, a statement of fact. The past was not a thing to be erased or overcome. It was a foundation. Every loss, every dream that had been cut short, was woven into the fabric of this new beginning. They were honoring those who weren't here to see it by building the future those people had fought for. Below them, the sacred grove rested in its canyon, the standing stones silent and enduring. It remained their spiritual anchor, the place where it had all truly begun. It was a reminder that their strength came from that deep ancient choice to unite. The ship was the branch extending from that rooted tree reaching for new suns. This was the true payoff. The first interstellar contact and colonization program owned by two species, not one. It was a new epoch. They were no longer just survivors on a hostile world or defenders of a single stronghold. They were explorers again. They were builders. They were a united people stepping onto a galactic stage, their future no longer a desperate hope but a path they were actively forging, together, into the stars. The network did not stop with them. It began as a whisper, a faint hum connecting Kevin and Zara, but then it expanded. It traveled through the shared handling of ancient weapons, through moments of collective grief after the final battle, through the simple act of building a wall or sharing a meal. The life bond became a living network, a web of connection threading through multiple people and then entire communities. It was uncharted territory for both species. This was not a technology that could be mapped or a doctrine that could be written down. It was a new way of being, and it required a fundamental shift in how they saw themselves and each other. This network created the foundation for a new kind of civilization, one built not on conquest or dominance but on mutual respect and a shared acceptance of risk. Old enemies who had once viewed each other with suspicion across a battlefield found themselves linked by this subtle thread of awareness. A human engineer and a Qatari scout, both wounded in the same skirmish years before, found themselves working side by side on a terraforming project. They didn't become friends overnight, but the network allowed a grudging respect to form. They could feel each other's focus, their dedication to the task. The old fear that had defined their relationship began to transform. It didn't vanish, but it was slowly replaced by a cautious, then genuine ambition for a shared future. The alliance's reach grew. Their first hybrid ship, Hope, was followed by others. They established outposts, then full settlements across a dozen neighboring star systems. Each new colony was a blend of human and Alari. Their architecture and social structures a fusion of both cultures. The coordination this expansion required was nearly psychic. A supply ship would arrive at a fledgling outpost with precisely the medical supplies that were running low, the need having been felt across the light years by a logistics officer on the homeworld. A scientific team on a desert planet would hit a breakthrough, and an engineering team on an ice moon would suddenly have the insight they needed to solve a structural problem. It was adaptability on a scale no purely technological society could ever achieve. This was the ultimate expression of the choice made in a cave years before. The decision to bond, to trust, to be vulnerable, had rippled outwards until it transformed the nature of their entire civilization. It redefined what was possible. They were no longer two separate species in a temporary alliance. They were becoming a single cooperative galactic culture, their individual strengths amplified by a connection that allowed them to act as one. The network was the living proof that their survival had never been the real goal. The real goal was to build something worth surviving for, something that could only be built together. The payoff was not just a secured future, but a transformed one, where the very fabric of society was woven from threads of shared understanding and unspoken trust. The family that grew in the years of peace became a living symbol. Their home was a blend of two worlds, the air often filled with the sounds of human standard mixing with the soft inflections of Alari. Their children carried this blend in their very blood, inheriting not just a unique lineage but a profound leadership potential that was both a gift and a weight. They did not ask for this legacy. It was placed upon them at birth, a story they were born into and tasked with continuing. Their eldest daughter, named Sarah for the woman lost in the crash, grew into a commander with a mind that fused her father's sharp strategy with her mother's deep intuition. She took charge of an interstellar exploration fleet, her command style a unique alloy of human decisiveness and Alari patience. Her brothers found their paths in the quieter arts of the new alliance. One moved into the delicate world of interstellar diplomacy, negotiating first contact protocols with species that remembered only the old fractured galaxy. The other turned to science. His work focused on merging human engineering principles with Alari biological sciences to create technologies that served both peoples. The youngest of them, still a child, began to show the early unmistakable signs of life bond affinity. She would know when her siblings were hurt or sad, feeling their distress across a settlement as a sharp personal ache. She spoke of threads of light connecting people, a vision her parents understood all too well. The network they had helped birth was not a static thing. It was growing, evolving, branching out in ways they had never anticipated, following its own organic logic. As Kevin and Zara aged, the sharp edges of command and crisis softened into the quieter work of stewardship. They often returned to the sacred grove, the place where their shared fate had truly crystallized. They would walk slowly among the silver-barked trees and the ancient standing stones, their steps measured, their hands linked. The memory of that first meeting felt both distant and immediate, a permanent part of the landscape in their souls. They watched their children navigate the world they had built. They saw Sarah's face on the view screens, giving calm orders to a mixed crew light years away. They read their sons' diplomatic briefs, which argued for understanding over ultimatums. They saw their youngest quietly comfort a playmate without a word being spoken. In these moments, they understood the true shape of their legacy. It was not a monument or a set of laws. It was a generation that had never known the galaxy as a place of isolation and fear. Their children were the living, breathing embodiment of the Alliance's core mission. They were not just carrying it forward. They were redefining it through their own choices, their own blended identities, ensuring that the fragile peace was not an endpoint, but a foundation for a future they would build in their own image. The story was theirs to tell now. They stood again in the sacred grove, the air cool and thick with the scent of wet stone and old growth. This was not the first time they had pledged themselves here, but it was different now. The promise was no longer just for them. It was a dedication cast forward, a vow for all who would follow in their footsteps, who would inherit the world they had shaped. Their children, their children's children, the countless souls who would never know the sound of a Cathari hunter in the dark, but would benefit from the peace bought with that fear. The galaxy they had helped build was still young, still fragile. It was a sapling, not an oak. It could still be broken by a strong enough storm, by a return to old hatreds, by the slow creep of forgetting why this unity mattered in the first place. The work was not finished. It had only changed form. The enemy was no longer at the gate. The enemy was complacency. It was the quiet assumption that the hard part was over. Kevin took Zara's hand. Her skin was still cool to the touch, a familiar and calming sensation. He looked at her, at the fine lines that now framed her eyes. Each one a story, a battle, a quiet moment of fear overcome. He did not speak the words as a question, but as a reaffirmation, his voice low and steady in the grove's deep quiet. Two souls, one heart, until the stars grow cold and dark. It was a refrain against the darkness, a quiet, stubborn declaration in the face of the vast cold emptiness between worlds. That emptiness was not just a physical reality. It was a potential for isolation, for retreating back into separate tribes and separate fears. Their promise was the opposite of that. It was a choice to build a fire in the void and share its warmth. The phrase crystallized everything. Every loss, every sacrifice, every moment of doubt had led to this single, unwavering conviction. Love and partnership were not soft ideals. They were the engine that would carry them forward, the only force strong enough to counter the old, tired logic of conquest. They had tried that path. It led to crash sites and silent graves. In choosing Zara, in forging this bond, Kevin had rediscovered what it meant to be human. It wasn't about independence or dominance. It was about connection, the strength to be vulnerable, the courage to need someone else. He had found his humanity not in clinging to it, but in sharing it. And Zara, in turn, had discovered what it meant to be Alari. Her people's wisdom was not meant to be hoarded, a secret to be kept. It was a gift to be given, a tool for building. Her identity was not diminished by blending with his. It was amplified, given new purpose and a new horizon. This was the final understanding, the true payoff that made sense of all the struggle. The reward was not a thing to be possessed. It was not a title, a territory, or a treasure. The reward was the journey itself. It was the ongoing, daily choice to connect, to lead with trust instead of fear, to build a new world with someone else's well-being held as dearly as your own. Their intertwined fate was not a sentence. It was the only prize that ever mattered. He saved what remained of his species. His reward was not a prize to be held in the hand. It wasn't a title or a throne or a chest of alien treasure. It was a responsibility that settled on his shoulders with the weight of two worlds. It was a bond that seared itself into his mind, a connection that could not be severed. It was a shared fate, irrevocably linking his future to that of a people he once didn't know existed. This was the hardest path, a road of constant sacrifice and impossible choices. It was not the easy victory of a single glorious battle. It was the daily grind of building trust where none had been, of making peace with ghosts, of leading when every instinct screamed to retreat behind familiar walls. The easy path was isolation. The simple choice was to be a fortress. He walked the difficult road of being a bridge. His reward was the fate of a tiny alien woman. It was the feel of Zara's cool hand in his, the quiet hum of her presence in the back of his mind, the certain knowledge that her pain was his pain, and her joy was his joy. Their lives were threads woven into a single tapestry. Her survival was his. Her people's future was his responsibility. He hadn't just saved humanity. He had accepted the burden of another species' hope. It was the chance to finally heal the deep, cold loneliness that had lived inside him since the crash. It was the opportunity to fill the silence Sarah left behind, not with more duty, but with genuine partnership. It was the strength he found, not in his own resolve but in their combined will, a force he used to protect every child in the root cellar, every settler behind the wall, every life weaker than his own. It was the wisdom to choose the right battle, not the battle for a piece of land or a stockpile of resources, but the battle for life itself. It was the understanding that true victory wasn't in destroying the enemy, but in building something the enemy's philosophy could never tear down. It was the mercy to offer a hand to old foes, to build a new world instead of just burning the old one to the ground. It was the honor of keeping a promise that cost him everything. It cost him his solitude, his simple grief, his uncomplicated view of the universe. It cost him the easy clarity of an us versus them existence. He promised to protect the colonists, and that promise grew to include an entire alien species. He promised to bond with Zara, and that vow rewired his very soul. The honor was in the keeping, not in the reward. This was the ultimate payoff, the final understanding that settled in his bones long after the fighting was done. His reward was the journey itself. Every hard choice, every moment of fear, every risk taken for connection. It was the decision to lead not from a place of fear and control, but from a place of love and a belief in what they could build together. The new world wasn't a place on a map. It was the ongoing act of building it day by day, choice by choice, together. The reward was never a destination. It was the path. The galaxy does not remember the war. Its echoes fade like background radiation. It remembers the choice made in a cave, sealed not with a handshake but with a bond that rewired two souls. It remembers the children who now walk on distant worlds, their heritage a blend of blood and starlight. This story asks what you would risk not for victory, but for true connection. Their fate is the final question posed to us all, hanging silent in the void between stars. Will we choose to build together or remain alone in the dark? The Cathari pack leader circled them in the darkness, its intelligence terrifying. Kevin knew this hunt was different. They were being studied, not just chased. Then Zara whispered 5 words that changed everything. The spirits protect us tonight. What ancient power did this alien woman command, and could it save humanity's last colony? The rationed power cells felt heavy in his hands, counted out like water drops on a scorching day. Each one represented another hour of perimeter lights, another night of safety from what hunted in the dark. Kevin's decisions came with ghosts. He still saw Sarah's face in the firelight, still heard her laugh that vanished in the crash. That loss was a cold weight he carried into every choice. Colony defenses kept failing. The Cathari weren't just attacking anymore, they were learning. Their raids cut power lines first, then hit the medical tents. They struck where it hurt most with a precision that felt almost thoughtful. The children learned to hide in root cellars before they could read their own names. Survival wasn't measured in harvests or seasons, but in sunsets. How many more until the fences failed for good? Then one evening, a blue-skinned figure stepped from the tree line. She didn't emerge like a threat. There was no aggression in her movement, only a fluid grace that seemed out of place on this harsh world. Her skin caught the fading light like polished stone, and her eyes held a stillness that felt older than the forest itself. She watched him for a long moment, her gaze tracing the reinforced walls, the patched-up barriers, the tired faces of the settlers. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the clear tone of wind chimes moving in a soft breeze. "You fought well today." The words landed like a blow he hadn't expected. Not a demand, not a warning, an observation. A compliment from a stranger who shouldn't have been watching their struggles. Kevin just stood there, covered in dust and sweat, his hand still resting on the faulty generator. He had prepared for threats, for negotiations, for another fight. He had no response for recognition. Her presence shifted something in the air. The settlers paused their work, watching from a distance. Children peeked from doorways. Even the usual sounds of the forest seemed to quieten around her. She didn't move closer, didn't make any gesture that could be read as hostile. She simply stood there, a living question mark in the twilight. Kevin realized his grip had tightened on the power cell in his hand. He forced his fingers to relax. This was new territory. Every previous encounter with native life had ended in violence or retreat. This felt different, dangerous in a way he couldn't yet name. She finally turned her head slightly, taking in the damaged western wall where the last attack had hit hardest. Her expression didn't change, but something in her posture suggested assessment, understanding. as if she'd seen this story before and knew how it typically ended. The compliment hung between them, unanswered. For the first time since the crash, Kevin felt something other than dread or determination. It was curiosity, sharp and unsettling. Who was this woman who walked out of the wilderness alone? Why was she here? And why did her simple observation feel like the most dangerous thing he'd faced yet? Zara's offer did not come with demands for territory or supplies. Instead, she named 5 ancient virtues handed down through her people. 5 qualities any warrior must prove. Her words had a ritual weight, carrying the rhythm of old chants. These weren't military objectives. They were moral choices. Courage meant facing fear, not denying it. Strength was more than muscle. It was the will to stand when others fell. Wisdom moved beyond knowledge, into the silent understanding of when to act and when to wait. Mercy asked for restraint even when vengeance felt justified. Honor was not a reputation, but how one acted when no one else was watching. Kevin listened with a soldier's caution. Each virtue carried echoes. He remembered Sarah's laughter in the mess hall back on the ship, the way she'd mock his seriousness. It was a sound now lost to vacuum and memory. Zara's proposal drew on something deeper than alliance. It called for a life bond, a joining of 2 beings into one shared existence. She described it plainly, her voice steady. 1 flesh, 1 spirit. It was not a metaphor. Her people believed such a bond could cross distance, ignore time, even outlast death itself. It offered a unity deeper than any human partnership. There would be no secrets, no hidden corners of the mind or heart. Every fear, every memory, every hope would become shared ground. That was the cost. Total vulnerability. No defenses, no private grief. Kevin had built walls around his pain, compartmentalized his failures, sealed away the face of every colonist he couldn't save. To open all of that to another, to let someone truly see the weight he carried, felt like a greater risk than walking unarmed into a Cathari nest. He looked at Zara, her blue skin stark under the colony's harsh lights, her eyes holding no judgment, only quiet certitude. She wasn't bargaining. She was offering a threshold. To cross it meant surrendering the one thing he'd protected above all else, his isolation. The bond once made could not be undone. Not by distance, not by conflict, not even by choice. It was permanent. A tether that would not break. The gravity of that commitment settled over him. For years, his leadership had been a solitary burden. He made the calls. He lived with the consequences. This was different. This asked him to trust not just a stranger, but her entire understanding of the world. Her people's rituals, their beliefs, their very way of being. It meant believing in something beyond tactics and terrain. He thought of the children hiding in the root cellars, their faces thin from rationing. He thought of the failing generators and the Cathari learning their patterns. His way was leading toward a slow, certain end. Hers offered a chance, but the price was everything he had left. Not his life, but the one thing that had kept him alive, his control. The silence stretched. The hum of the perimeter fence seemed louder suddenly, a fragile barrier against the waiting dark. The river's rush was a constant low roar in the twilight, cold spray hitting their faces as they reached the bank. Zara pointed toward a line of half-submerged stones, dark and slick, leading across the churning water. They looked precarious, spaced just far enough apart to demand a leap of faith with each step. Kevin's eyes scanned the opposite shore, steep, rocky, offering little cover if things went wrong. Behind them, the forest had gone quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of an untouched wood, but the tense, waiting silence of something hunting. The Cathari were close now. He could feel their presence like a pressure change in the air. They moved without sound, but their patience was a weapon. They weren't rushing. They were hurting. Zara stepped onto the first stone, her balance sure and fluid. She didn't look back, but her words cut through the water's noise. They won't follow. Water is a barrier to them. It was a statement, not a suggestion. Every part of his training rejected it. Trusting an alien's understanding of local geography over his own instincts felt like a gamble with their lives. Rivers were crossings, not refuges. They were places of exposure, of vulnerability. But the alternative was turning to face hunters he couldn't see in a forest they knew better than he did. He took a breath and followed, his boots slipping on the wet stone. The current tugged hard at his legs, threatening to pull him under. He focused on Zara's back, on the precise way she moved from one rock to the next, never hesitating. Then he saw it. On the bank they'd just left, shadows detached themselves from the trees. The Cathari pack leader emerged first, its sleek form tense, eyes reflecting the dim light. It paced along the edge, sniffing the air, but it did not enter the water. It watched them head low, a predator denied its prey. Zara had been right.